Welcome to Global Dispatches, a podcast for the foreign policy and global development communities and anyone who wants a deeper understanding of what is driving events in the world today. I'm your host, Mark Leon Goldberg, editor of UN Dispatch. Enjoy the show. Today's episode was recorded live in front of a virtual audience in advance of a key meeting at the United Nations known as the Food Systems Summit. I moderate a discussion in which panelists explore the links between food systems and climate change, specifically how the Food Systems Summit can harness action on climate change, and how the incoming major international climate meeting in Glasgow this November, known as COP26, can inspire action on food systems. This episode is produced in partnership with CGIAR, the world's largest agricultural innovation network. It kicks off with introductory remarks by Gernot Laganda, Chief of Climate and Disaster Risk Reduction Programs at the World Food Programme, followed by Peter Lederach, Principal Climate Scientist with CGIAR and the World Food Programme. I then moderate a panel discussion followed by audience questions. Finally, Christine Schneeberger, Deputy Head of Global Cooperation at the Swiss Agency for Development and Cooperation, offers concluding remarks. Enjoy. This is a timely conversation coming a little more than a week before the UN Food Systems Summit and several weeks ahead of COP26 in Glasgow. And now here is Gernot Laganda, Chief of Climate and Disaster Risk Reduction Programs at the World Food Programme.
Dear colleagues from around the world, a very warm welcome to this long-awaited conversation on the links between climate action and food systems transformation. My name is Gernot Laganda. I'm leading the Climate and Disaster Risk Reduction Programs at the United Nations World Food Programme. Like many of you, I've been following the build-up to two of the biggest events that are taking place at the UN this year, the UN Food Systems Summit and the 26th Conference of Parties to the UN Climate Convention. And like many of you, I'm asking myself what these summits are going to do differently to help us tackle some of the biggest, most complex, and most daunting problems the world is facing. In WFP, we get reminded each day what happens when food systems break down. This is when people go hungry, and when humanitarian assistance is often the only remaining option for people to feed themselves and their families. And when we look at our global hunger map this year, then we notice countries and regions flashing in deep dark red, where in the past we weren't used to such breakdowns. This shows that by and large, food systems are quite vulnerable to changes in climate and also to growing social and economic inequalities. And at the same time, they contribute a third of global greenhouse gas emissions, which then boomerang into the climate extremes that lead to supply chain disruptions, food price hikes, hunger, and malnutrition. Both big conversations this year, the Food Systems Summit and COP26, are conversations about systems rather than sectors. And this in itself is of great importance, given that we live in an interconnected world that doesn't lend itself very well to change when we cannot find ways to step back from our own disciplines, countries, sectors, or institutions. Without thinking in systems, we cannot understand whether we are more part of the problem or more part of the solution to our broken food systems and our overheating climate. On that very note, the Food Systems Summit on the 23rd of September has made a purposeful decision to keep the term systems in its center, even though it may not be very intuitive for many people to do so. It isn't the World Agriculture Summit or the World Food Summit. By associating the conversation with a system rather than a sector, this conversation acknowledges the globalized and wide-ranging impacts we generate by producing, processing, transporting, and consuming food the way we do. And it also recognizes a growing set of risks that affect our food supply chains. On the other side of the Food Systems Summit, and only a few weeks later, the international community will be coming together in Glasgow to grapple with an accelerating climate crisis. More than 190 countries will be around the table with different plans, approaches, and expectations to keep warming to under 1.5 degrees centigrade and adapt to the growing impacts of climate change, from heat waves and wildfires to floods, storms, and devastating droughts. But it's not only the extreme events that have these countries worried. Lower-level climatic variations and stresses also play a big role, especially for food systems. Untimely rainfall, changing seasons, growing salinity in soils and groundwater, shifts in pest infestations and diseases, loss of biodiversity and heat stress in crops and livestock. These are all factors that influence food production, access, and availability. So when we look a little bit more closely at the systems that bring food to our tables and the systems that govern human interaction with the climate, then it is easy to see how extremely relevant these two are to each other. Food systems have the potential to aggravate global warming or to reduce it. And climate action can make our food systems more sustainable and resilient, or miss out on an extremely effective lever of change. This is why we are coming together today with a coalition of other like-minded platforms, governments, and institutions to encourage a stronger linkage between the Food Systems Summit and COP26. We are convinced that food systems transformation, if done right, can accelerate climate action. And conversely, climate action can enable and sometimes even trigger food systems transformation. We believe that the various partners and platforms represented here today, some of which are not generally associated with the food systems dialogue, have a lot to offer when it comes to the adaptation and the de-risking of food systems in a changing climate. And in the first stage of this relay, I'm now going to hand over to my colleague Peter Lederach, who embodies the food system and climate interface like nobody else I know. Peter is a climate scientist working for the Consultative Group on International Agricultural Research. He's an expert on food systems and with support from Switzerland, seconded to the WFP climate team. Peter will be teeing us off with a baseline framing on how food systems and climate action interrelate, and then hand over to Mark Goldberg for the panel conversation. With this, I wish you an inspiring and energizing event, and I look forward to continuing the conversation. Peter, over to you, please.
Thank you so much, Gernot, for the kind introduction. So, dear audience, we have a very interesting agenda for you today. So I'm going to continue setting the scene for the next 10 minutes. Then we're going to have a high-level panel discussing within a moderated panel discussion. We have Mark Goldberg from Global Dispatches podcast, who's going to moderate the discussion. The 5 panelists are inspiring leaders from the intersection of food systems and climate change, as already mentioned by Gernot. We also have worked in this group of panelists and colleagues on a position paper. The position paper will be launched on the 20th of September, just before the Food Systems Summit. It will discuss the same topics that we're discussing today. So let me start. Today's discussion is about climate action to transform food systems and the importance of food systems to tackle the climate crisis. The climate crisis is here and now. This year was another unprecedented year, like all the years in the past 10 or so years. So we had, for the first time, rain in Greenland. We had floods all over Europe. We had fires in Australia, Central Asia, Northern America, and a lot of other extreme events. We also have to recognize that a lot of those extreme events happen in Africa, many more Africa and in the southern countries, sometimes even more than in the north, but they're very much underrepresented. A paper that came last week, or an opinion piece that came out last week in the Independent, discussed that extremes are very much underreported in Africa compared to the north. So this has to change. So the message is the climate crisis is now and here. Of course, this is all going to become, unfortunately, even worse by 2030 and 2050. But the climate crisis has arrived to our doorsteps. So then, what are food systems? I like very much the 2 minutes introduction video of Agnes Kalibata, the special envoy for the Food Systems Summit. She says, food is more than what we eat. Food is water. Food is land. Food is our culture. Food is labor. Food is technologies. It is economies and policies. Food is everything. And food systems are connecting all those different dimensions. Also, we have to know that there's not one food systems. There's many food systems. If you think of a smallholder farmer in Africa, her food system is very different to a person that lives in a mega city in Asia, or maybe a vegan or a vegetarian. So food systems, there are many food systems and they vary greatly. The fortunate among us can decide 3 times a day what we want to eat and how our food systems look like. So then what are the impacts of food systems on the climate crisis? Here just a couple numbers. Agriculture is responsible for 80% of deforestation. Data shows between 2000 and 2010. Food systems are responsible for roughly 20 to 40% of annual greenhouse gas emissions. And agriculture uses 86% of anthropogenic nitrogen. So there's severe impacts of food systems on the climate crisis. But then, on the other hand, what is the impact of the climate crisis on food systems? So again, a few numbers here to highlight that. Over the last decades, we've seen reduced agricultural production by 1 to 5% per decade. And this is continuing and increasing in severity. We also know that children of age below 5 are 50% more likely to be malnourished when born during a drought. And this leads us then to that hunger is on the rise as a consequence of climate extremes, climate variability, and of course, many other interlinked factors such as conflict, economic shocks. So there's huge impacts of the climate crisis on food systems. And this then also leads to the acknowledgement, slowly, but fortunately, the international community is acknowledging that climate impacts on food system can exacerbate conflicts and insecurity. So it's not anymore only about the food and the food system, but it goes much beyond. Then, now getting to a bit more the action-oriented part here of my introduction. So as Gernot said, we're here today to discuss the linkages of the UN Food System Summit and the COP. So the UN Food System Summit aims to raise global awareness and encourage commitments towards healthier, more sustainable and equitable food systems. On the other side, the COP aims to secure global net zero by 2050 and keep the temperature of the planet under control by limiting its increase to 1.5 degrees. There's a concern that those two big summits, important summits in 2021, are not sufficiently linked. And with that, their agendas. Food system is insufficiently linked to the COP, and the COP or the climate to the Food System Summit. And this has to change. This is a unique opportunity that we have here. That's why we put up this expert discussion and high-level panel of today. And as an entry point to kick us off for the discussion, we can look at the national determined contributions, the mechanisms to link the UN Food System Summit to the COP. So just a few numbers here also. We know that more than 90% of country NDCs do not take into consideration the entire food system. So there's a huge opportunity to include food systems in the revision of the NDCs now coming up for the COP in Glasgow in November. We also know that 12.5 gigatons of CO2 reduction in annual greenhouse gas emission might result from including diets, food loss, and waste in national climate plans and NDCs. We also know that 20% of the global emissions reductions needed by 2050 can be delivered through improved climate action in food systems. So we have concrete entry point of what we can jointly do to bolster the NDCs. So with that, I hope that I have given a good overview and set the scene for our panel discussion. So I will now hand over to Mark Goldberg from Global Dispatches podcast, who will introduce the panelists and moderate the panel discussion. Over to you, Mark.
Thank you, Peter, and welcome everyone. My name is Mark Leon Goldberg. I'm the editor of UN Dispatch and host of the Global Dispatches podcast. Today's conversation is being recorded as a live taping of the podcast. Peter Lederach did a great job of setting up some key questions before us today, and it is now my honor to introduce an excellent panel for further discussion. Walter E. Batgen, PhD, is Director of the Regional and Sectoral Research Program in the International Research Institute for Climate and Society. Welcome.
Welcome, thank you.
Astrid Zwick is Head of the INSU Resilience Global Partnership Secretariat. Welcome.
Thank you. Welcome.
Jerry Velasquez is Director of the Division of Mitigation and Adaptation at the Green Climate Fund. Welcome.
Hello.
Salimul Hook is Director of the International Center for Climate Change and Development and Action Track 5 Chair for the UN Food Systems Summit. Welcome. And Ben Webster is Head of Secretariat for the Risk-Informed Early Action Partnership. So I have a number of questions I will ask our panelists. We will then open it up to questions from the audience. To ask a question of the panelist, please simply leave your question in the comment field wherever you are listening and watching this program. With that, let me jump into my questions for the panelists. And Dr. Salimul Hook, the first question will go to you. Please help us set the scene. You are chair for Action Track 5 of the UN Food Systems Summit, which aims to build community resilience to vulnerabilities, shocks, and stress. The pre-summit of the Food Systems Summit, which took place back in July in Rome, brought young people, farmers, indigenous people, civil society, research, policy leaders, and representatives from the private sector together to present scientific evidence, launch commitments, and mobilize new financing and partnerships. In your opinion, what have been the main takeaways from this, particularly about the importance of harnessing climate action to transform food systems and the importance of food systems to tackle the climate crisis?
Thank you very much, Mark. Prior to my being invited to chair Action Track 5 on resilience of the Food System Summit over the last year and a bit, I have been engaged in the UN Framework Convention on Climate Change for many, many years, working on vulnerable communities and adaptation to climate change. So the two come together in my own mind and my own work very, very closely. It was a privilege for me to chair Action Track 5 on resilience of the Food System Summit. We did a lot of consultations with many, many different groups, and in particular with young people, youth groups, which we feel are some of the most important elements in terms of system change. We've been talking, we heard both from the previous speakers, Gernot and Peter, that we're talking about system change and not just incremental change anymore. We simply don't have time for incremental changes anymore. We need to go for systematic and systemic changes. And in that context, I feel young people have by far the biggest role to play. They are the ones with the energy. They are the ones who are going to inherit the future, and they are the ones who can shape the future. And I'm very, very pleased to see that under the UN Food System Summit, we have engaged with young people in a very big way. Each of the action tracks have a vice chair for youth. They are doing just the day before the summit on the 22nd of September, and they will then be linking this with the pre-COP Youth Summit that will take place in Italy, in Milan, just before the COP that takes place in Glasgow in November. So this is a single thread. It starts with the Food System Summit and then goes to the Climate Change Summit and then goes further beyond that into the next 10 years of trying to make food systems all over the world, but particularly in the most vulnerable countries, resilient to the impacts of climate change, as well as other kinds of shocks that we have seen, like the COVID-19 shock that we had for the last year and a half. So I am very hopeful that we will be able to do this. It's a huge challenge. It's not going to be easy, but it is something that we have tremendous energy behind and a lot of people engaged in doing. And to me, that is really the biggest outcome of the Food System Summit is the energy of many, many different people that have engaged in it. It's not just governments talking to each other and writing a piece of paper, but it is many, many different constituencies involved. And I would pick young people as perhaps the most important one.
Thank you. Ben Webster, Astrid Zwick, and Walter Batgen, I have a similar set of questions for each of you. Ben Webster, I will start with you. Ben, please explain to our audience what the Risk-Informed Early Action Partnership is and what it aims to achieve.
Thanks, Mark. Good to be here. Well, just to start by saying what we mean by risk-informed early action. So this is action that can be taken predicated on a forecast or collective risk analysis that actually takes place before these hazards happen, whether that's floods or a storm or drought now. But these are actions that can actually help to reduce the impact of those hazards. And there's been great progress in recent years using the improved climate information services to take early or anticipatory approaches from UN agencies, the Red Cross, Red Crescent, civil society actors. But in 2019, governments, these groups of agencies, the implementing partners came together to say, we really want to see these approaches taken to scale. We've seen that they save more lives, provide more dignified assistance for people, but how can we create this systemic shift? And therefore, REAP, or the Risk-Informed Early Action Partnership, was created to bring together these different stakeholder groups. And we have a target to make 1 billion people safer from disaster by 2025. So really our role is to convene this conversation, to bring together the different actors involved so that we can see this systemic shift from reactive humanitarian response that takes place after the hazard has already turned into disaster, shift to proactive risk management that can actually help to reduce the impact of these hazards before they've even hit the most vulnerable communities. So that's what we're aiming to do, and we really look forward to taking part in this conversation today.
Thank you. Thank you very much. And Astrid, over to you. What is the INSU Resilience Global Partnership, and what does it aim to achieve?
Thank you very much, Mark. The INSU Resilience Global Partnership is a truly global coalition of various stakeholders to increase the resilience of poor and vulnerable people in vulnerable countries. And that through the help of a large instrumentarium, namely climate and disaster risk finance and insurance solutions. We are now a growing partnership and are having 109 members currently from governments, academia, multilateral organizations, private sector, to really help to scale up pre-arranged, predictable financing for early action, relief, and recovery. So the full suite of the risk continuum. And through that, we also really want to provide and promote the change, the transformational change that needs to happen, a shift from ex post to ex ante action to really manage risk in a timely manner, in an efficient manner. This is also critical to safeguard the resilience of food systems. And behind that, we are gathering and convening our different stakeholders under a grand Vision 2025, with the aim of protecting and covering 500 million poor and vulnerable people from the impact of disasters. We also want to support 80 countries with designing comprehensive climate and disaster risk finance and insurance strategies. We also get support by the private sector with an additional $5 billion insurance coverage and support. And of course, we want to narrow the protection gap and reduce the annual climate and disaster risk losses by 10% in these countries. And we have achieved quite some results. We have 22 large programs out in more than 100 countries with more than 200 projects. And by that, and the INSU Resilience Global Partnership was launched at the COP23 in 2017. Until now, we can provide coverage to 137 million people through active solutions of climate and disaster risk finance and insurance. We have reached 33 countries with a comprehensive strategy on climate and disaster risk finance, and 49 out of 60 countries we want to reach with active solutions at governmental level. I think I can continue later with more details, but for now, this overview. Thank you. Over to you, Mark.
Thank you. Thank you, Astrid. And Walter, now to you. Can you explain to us what is the Digital Climate Advisory Service Blueprint and what it aims to achieve?
Sure. Thank you, Mark. So we all know that climate has always been a determinant factor for agricultural production. But a changing climate is imposing new and very important challenges. And therefore, more than ever, we need decisions in agriculture that are supported with best possible climate information. Now, on the other hand, there is a dramatic increase in the use of digital tools in agriculture, tools for automating processes, to analyze huge amounts of data, to generate recommendations that incorporate climate information to improve agriculture production. And actually those tools, a lot of those tools that incorporate climate information, these digital tools, to support agricultural decisions are being increasingly used by quite a lot of commercial agriculture farmers. The challenge is, how do we ensure that those tools are also accessible for the 300 million small farmers in the world? And so this blueprint, I think it's a wonderful document, like a roadmap, with input from more than 150 stakeholders representing 25 institutions that come from development institutes, from research institutes, from the private sector. And this blueprint, this roadmap, does basically four things. One, it analyzes the investment needs to reach 300 million small farmers around the world. It also assesses the expected return of those investments. It then defines what are the characteristics, the principles of digital advisory systems that should guide those investments. And then finally, and I think very importantly, it clarifies the roles of the public sector and the private sector in different countries to ensure that these advisory tools reach every farmer, small farmers and commercial farmers. So I think it's a document that is, I consider, very, very useful, very conceptually very robust, but at the same time, a very nice practical roadmap to guide these investments.
Thank you. And I'll now turn to Jerry Velasquez. Jerry, the Green Climate Fund is the largest multilateral funder of climate adaptation and mitigation globally. GCF supports the climate action solutions represented by the colleagues here on this panel, namely early action, insurance, and climate services. Can you please explain to the audience what GCF aims to achieve and how these solutions help you achieve these goals?
Many thanks. So, as you've already explained, we are a financial instrument of the Framework Convention on Climate Change, in particular the Paris Agreement. There is one particular goal that we hope to achieve, and that is to maintain a balance of our investment, 50% on adaptation, 50% on mitigation. At this point, in fact, we have more projects on mitigation. We're about 47% adaptation. So it actually is an important aspect for us to make that balance, to invest more on projects that focus on adaptation. And in addition to agriculture and food security, early warning, early action, insurance, and climate services fall into that category of building resilience and adaptation. So it actually is a no-brainer for us to partner with REAP and ensure resilience, because we hope to actually encourage our partners to send us more transformative projects. The GCF is quite unique because what we hope to do is to invest at scale and to create transformation, call it paradigm shift. So these kind of investments are the ones that we are looking for. And we do hope that through partnership with REAP and Ensure Resilience, we could develop those projects in the future.
Thank you. I'm going to now turn back to Salim Hook. There have been concerns that climate is not properly represented in the UN Food Systems Summit. Often people say climate has its own track through the UNFCCC process and COP26 and does not need to link to the UN Food Systems Summit specifically. And this disconnection works both ways as well. Food systems have in the past not been reflected in the COPs. First, I'd like to know if you share this concern that climate action and food systems aren't properly linked together. And secondly, can you provide some advice on what needs to be done to link Food Systems Summit and COP's agendas on food systems and climate and vice versa?
That's an excellent question, Mark. And indeed, it is. Sometimes one gets the impression that there are silos in which one issue is discussed in one venue by one set of actors and another issue is discussed in another silo with a different set of actors, even within governments, different groups or different ministries or institutions. But the issues of food systems as well as climate change are so cross-cutting and so interconnected, whether it be at the local level, at a very local level, or even within a country, or at the global level, that they are just impossible to be disentangled. And one of the reasons why I accepted the invitation to chair Action Track 5 on resilience of the Food System Summit, although I'm not a food system person myself, was to make that connection, to hopefully enable the Food System Summit to be informed about the climate change implications. And in fact, several of the outcomes, that one major alliance coming out of the Food System Summit will be on making food systems more resilient to climate change. And I will be very strongly associated with that going out of the summit. As you know, the summit is going to launch a set of activities. It's not going to end with some kind of a declaration. It's going to set in train activities going forward with different alliances. And one of them will be linking to climate change. And in the climate change arena, you're quite right. Food and agriculture have not been taken very much integrated into the activities of climate change, both on the mitigation side, where agriculture plays a big role in emissions of greenhouse gases, as well as on the adaptation side, where agriculture in particular and food systems more broadly are extremely vulnerable to the impacts of climate change. So hopefully, as I said earlier, the connection of the Food System Summit taking place in September, and then going forward to the COP26 of the Climate Framework Convention in November, will be able to make that link on a much more substantive manner and take forward the recommendations and the actions, more importantly, that will be able to make our food systems more robust in the light of climate change as well. The two are inextricably linked. One cannot do one without the other, in my view. And hopefully we'll be able to manage to bring that together in the coming months.
Thank you. And again, I have a set of questions for Ben Webster, Astrid Zwick, and Walter Batkin. The platforms that each of you represent can be broadly framed as climate actions that deal with the potential of risk of shocks and stressors through risk reduction and management. However, we know that climate action also has the potential to transform food systems. Can you give us an idea and examples of how your initiatives tackle some of the challenges food systems face right now by supporting its transformation? And Ben, let's start with you.
Thanks, Mark. Maybe just to start by saying I completely agree with Salim. You know, these different risks and different issues, they are overlaying and they're compound. We've seen it with COVID-19. We cannot extricate all these different issues from one another. And therefore, that means, we have to increase our risk literacy and understanding of the language and the issues involved in managing these different risks. And B, we have to try and deal with them in a much more holistic way. And therefore, as the Risk Informed Early Action Partnership, we are trying to bring together these different stakeholders involved, reduce the silos that Celine mentioned, between government departments, between the humanitarian community, the climate community, the development community, and exchange the learning and ensure that we are working on this together. So just to provide a quick example from one of our partners working in India with the Ministry of Rural Development there, one of the world's biggest social protection mechanisms focused on public works they've been able to adapt it to ensure it's more shock responsive. So it provides 100 days of wage employment for the rural population around India, but has an extra risk management component of an extra 50 days that can trigger in the case of an extreme drought. Now, in the past, that has triggered late and hasn't enabled the communities and the families and the farmers in particular to benefit during that hardest period of the drought. But now, through support from the Institute of Environment and Development, they've been able to adapt that so that it can trigger in advance of the worst impact of the drought so that people can become more resilient. And of course, that impacts on the agriculture sector in the rural parts of India, making people more resilient. So we're looking for these small adaptations that can really have a huge impact across the sectors.
Thank you. And Astrid, over to you. Can you give us an idea and share some examples of how your initiatives tackle some of the challenges food systems face and by supporting food systems transformation?
Thank you very much, Mark. Yes, our implementing members and partners of the Injury Resilience Global Partnership are here to develop and provide climate and disaster risk finance and insurance solutions that are able to transfer residual risks that cannot be prevented, risks that cannot be reduced or mitigated. So this is a cost-effective way to do so. Food systems, of course, need to be adapted where possible, and we have seen through the various studies that adaptation is very key here, and having adaptation strategies. And climate and disaster risk finance and insurance thus naturally can provide a part of a comprehensive adaptation strategy. And there's a good interface when you look at the partnership and the implementing partners. Many of these implementing programs are having a focus on risk transfer in the agricultural context. I give you some examples. Particularly at the governmental level, implementing partners are providing support, for example, through the role of regional risk pools. The African risk capacity is one of these examples. It's an African Union initiative designed to improve responses to drought-induced food crisis and builds on membership states' capacities to manage this risk with the pooling solutions. In 2020, for example, the payouts for crisis were $28 million for 5 African countries to kickstart their contingency plans they have to prepare when embarking on the African risk capacity. At a micro scale, and especially looking at micro entrepreneurs, at the individual farmers or so, there is a World Bank managed program called the Global Index Insurance Facility. And this is particularly geared to the micro level, as we call it. We cover with that already 40 million beneficiaries that have acquired protection under this scheme. This is especially currently running in about 10 countries. We have also another very interesting scheme for the bottom of the pyramid, very, very poor people, with the World Food Program's R4, the Rural Resilience Initiative, providing insurance for risk management activities, which is quite an interesting solution. I can continue with some local activities in Pakistan, the Kash Foundation, a non-banking microfinance organization, also looking into particularly supporting women. And in Madagascar, also looking at food and agricultural value chains and supporting the adaptation of these.
Thank you.
So I stop here and hand over to you, Mark.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Astrid. And Walter, over to you with the same question.
So we're talking about climate-informed digital advisory tools, and we have many examples around the world, including with small farmers, how these advisory tools can be very helpful in improving the sustainability of food production systems. For example, improving farmer decisions on what crops to plant, when to plant them, what management practices to use based on good risk management and risk assessment. On the other hand, these digital tools can provide very, very valuable information on the expected prices. This is something that is increasingly important for small farmers. So information on the expected prices of the food that farmers are producing or they're planning to produce, and how those prices can change due to climate shocks. They can also, these digital tools can also be instrumentals, and here again we have many examples around the developing world, to design robust insurance tools or other financial tools that help farmers to transfer the risks that they cannot manage. Now, all of these are examples of how these digital advisory tools help food systems in the food production stages. But these digital tools can also establish early warning systems, for example, that can be instrumental in other phases of the food system. For example, early warning systems that can be very helpful in the transportation of food, in the distribution, and in the storage of food. So there is a lot of examples already in the world of how these digital advisory tools are helping food systems across the different components.
Thank you. And I'm going to turn it back to Jerry Velasquez. The Green Climate Fund has largely been supporting climate action, mitigation, and adaptation programs, but perhaps focuses less on food systems. I know that you were inspired by the Food Systems Pre-Summit in Rome back in July, and that you have identified opportunities for additional projects that GCF could fund to help transform food systems. Can you tell us about the gaps you have identified and what means the Green Climate Fund has to support the transformation of food systems through climate action?
Many thanks. So during the first 5 years of operations of the GCF, we invested about $5.5 billion in total. But on food and agriculture, we only invested about $400 million. So fundamentally about $100 million per year. In our first replenishment, which is 2020 to 2023, we have more money, about $10 billion, and we have to invest it in a shorter period, 4 years. This means we have to double our programming. And fundamentally, it means that we have to, at the bare minimum, invest about $200 million per year on agriculture and food security. 2 years on, 2020, 2021, we've only invested $173 million on food and agriculture. So that means we are so late in this topic. And what is the reason for that? And this actually is it's a serious problem for us, because we would like to, in fact, invest more on food security and agriculture. And in the coming 2 years, we really need to double our effort. We need to invest, at the very least, about $600 to $700 million. Now, how can we do that? We already work with some of the partners here. WFP, we have 3 projects, but their projects are fairly small. I think Mozambique, Senegal, and Zimbabwe. Our larger partners are the World Bank, IFAD, and FAO. There's a very interesting project that we recently approved for IFAD. It's in the Sahel region. It has 3 components. One is an climate information services for agriculture. That's the first component. That then allows for climate smart agriculture. That's the second component, which then is linked to insurance, which is both micro, managed by WFP, and sovereign, which is the Africa capacity. This is a $140 million project. Now, what we need are more projects like this, larger projects. Probably, maybe this could serve as an inspiration, probably, for example, in the Caribbean, in CRIF. So we hope that this could serve as an inspiration and more projects like this.
Thank you. I have a final round of questions for our panelists. A reminder, if you would like to ask a question of the panelists, please simply leave your question in the comment field wherever you are viewing this live webcast. So I have the same question for each of you. We heard from Peter Ladderach's opening remarks that there exists a unique opportunity through the revision of the nationally determined contributions, the NDCs, in preparation of COP26, to set targets and initiatives that reduce the impact of unsustainable food systems on the global climate, while at the same time helping agriculture and food sectors become more resilient to the impacts of climate change. What is your institution doing to capitalize on this very unique opportunity? And Salimo, I'll go with you first.
Thank you very much, Mark. And that's an excellent question and an excellent opportunity in my view. So a couple of things that my institution, which is the International Center for Climate Change and Development based at the Independent University, Bangladesh, is involved in. Firstly, in my country, Bangladesh, we have been providing inputs to the Nationally Determined Contribution NDC of Bangladesh, which originally the first INDC did not include the agriculture and land use sector, but this time the new NDC, which has just been submitted by the government of Bangladesh, has included agriculture and the food systems and land use in a bigger way than it had before. And that, I think, is an extremely important way forward. And I understand that quite a few other NDCs of developing countries are beginning to do that as well. That's a good sign. At a more general, across the different vulnerable countries, I run my center runs a network of universities from the least developed countries. It's called the LDC Universities Consortium on Climate Change. And we have university partners in about 20 LDCs. We hope to do all 48 LDCs within another year or two. But in the 20 LDCs that we are already operating with partners, the universities in those countries are beginning to look at this sector in a much, much more significant way. They worked on climate change adaptation and also looking at food systems at the same time. So we are hoping to build national level capacity to do research and to provide research inputs into national planning and national development going forward as well.
Thank you. And Astrid, over to you. How is your institution harnessing this unique moment in preparation of the NDCs?
Thank you, Mark. The NDCs, as well as the NAPs, the National Adaptation Plans, are key to the implementation of the Paris Agreement. And our aim is to integrate climate and disaster risk finance and insurance into the toolkit they are providing when they advise and support countries in their strategies. What we have done so far is we have worked together with UNFCCC and other partners to develop a policy note including 5 action areas to integrate and how to integrate climate and disaster risk finance and insurance into the NDCs. And the action areas comprise capacity building initiatives, supporting climate policymakers with expertise, and so on. There's a collaboration, and we are looking for piloting that in various regions. Very recently, we also have published a report we've drafted together with the National Adaptation Plan Global Network to look for, it was an analysis the NAP Global Network has conducted to look for entry points of climate and disaster risk finance and insurance into the national adaptation plans. And here we have launched a report with respective recommendations. So this is a concrete action we've taken, and we will drive forward still and try to really become a part of the toolkit driving comprehensive adaptation strategies forward.
Thank you. And now, Walter, over to you.
So I think, the reason why we are having this event is that we all agree that we need to bring together the discussions on the climate change adaptation, climate change mitigation, and sustainable food systems. Now, the elaboration of the NDCs and the NAPs are formal environments where the climate communities at the country level interact with the communities that are working in different sectors, including those working in food systems. And therefore, we at the IRI, the International Research Institute for Climate and Society of Columbia University, we realize that these are very concrete opportunities and outstanding opportunities to contribute to some real action for connecting these communities. So, in the NDCs, the countries are making commitment to help mitigate climate change, but at the same time, they need to ensure the sustainability of the food systems. So at the IRI, we're making big efforts to ensure that we contribute to the NDC process. Sometimes what we do is we help the meteorological institutes to connect better with the stakeholders. Sometimes we connect directly through the agricultural institutions. And we are contributing to the NDCs in several countries, including Ethiopia, Guatemala, Colombia, Vietnam, Uruguay, and we will now start contributing to NDCs in several other African countries in a new project, big project funded by the World Bank with the CGIAR.
Thank you. And Ben, to you.
Thanks, Mark. I mentioned earlier that we're trying to provide these more holistic approaches to risk management, and the partnership's first target, so REAP Target 1, is focused on countries integrating their climate change adaptation and disaster risk management policies, plans, legislative frameworks, and so on. And in this space, obviously, the NDCs and the NAPs, as Astrid mentioned as well, are critical in terms of bringing this more holistic approach. And recently, the UN Office for Disaster Risk Reduction, UNDRR, has asked us to help convene some of the different actors or stakeholders who are involved in supporting governments to develop these policies, plans, and legislative frameworks so that we can align efforts more effectively. We can ensure we have similar approaches and tools, that we know who is supporting which governments on which particular issues. So I think there's a lot of desire and will to support governments to develop these more holistic, more effective policies and plans and so on. But our role is trying to facilitate that coordination and ensure that we're all pulling in the same direction.
Thank you. And Jerry, before I turn to you for some concluding remarks, let me once again remind viewers that we are about to get to your questions. To ask a question, please simply leave your question as a comment in the field wherever you are watching the live stream, and we'll get to those momentarily. But first, let's hear some concluding remarks from Jerry. Over to you.
Many thanks. So at the GCF, we support countries to update their NDCs, but also to convert their NDCs into investment plans. And to do this, we provide countries with a grant of $1 million per year in a flexible way to do these things. In addition to this, what we call the readiness grant, which is this $1 million per year, we also provide up to $3 million to countries to develop what we call the National Adaptation Plan for Climate Change. Most countries will focus this on various issues, including water, agriculture, and other particular issues that are of importance to them. So we do provide this kind of support. At the moment, we are on request of the SIDS. We are providing support to update their NDCs through the NDC partnership and UNDP. But our main focus is to convert these strategies into investment plans.
Thank you. I am now going to hand the virtual microphone over to Rhys Bucknall-Williams from CGIAR, who has been monitoring the questions coming in from the audience. Rhys, over to you.
Hi, everybody. Thank you so much for the discussions today. And yes, lots of comments and chat on the various live stream platforms. So we have a number of questions to run through. It'd be great to get your thoughts. And perhaps the first one might be aimed at Astrid, although others are very welcome to chip in on this. So, I mean, we've seen initiatives like the new Financial Alliance for Net Zero Emissions, which sort of brought together financial institutions that have trillions of assets under management. So, looking at the UN Food System Summit and COP26, from the kind of private sector and sort of investment angle, like what kind of commitments could we see at these two summits that could help the private sector sort of achieve our goals? Incorporating things such as risk, for example.
Thank you. I hope I understood that well. So what can be done and what's probably coming up is that, of course, through the for initiatives like our partnerships, we are trying to convene our actors among common activities, common goals to really scale up action. For example, we are very much looking into the impact of our activities underneath the Injury Resilience Global Partnership. And we are currently creating, together with our partners, an evidence roadmap that is going to be launched during the climate conference of the parties. And we also are looking into other topics like including the gender aspects and gender dimensions. So we are going to launch our Excellence Center on Gender Smart Solutions during that conference of the parties as well. So there are a lot of activities out, but also we are striving to develop discussions further on how to really be able to scale up. And we are working together with the private sector here strongly to really include expertise on that side in develop tailor-made solutions in particular countries. The tripartite agreement is one example. So it's a coalition with the Insurance Development Forum, and that is also one part of the activities. Over to you.
Thank you, Astrid. So we have a question from Franz, who notes that under Action Track 5 of the UN Food System Summit process, there have been a number of game-changing solutions being submitted, including sort of digital tools, including one like we have at the CGIAR, which is the Climate Security Observatory. So maybe this question is perhaps best directed to Ben, but others are also welcome to come in on this. But which sort of are you aware of the game-changing solutions being sort of proposed, and which of these are most promising for thinking about peace and security and stability and crisis management?
Thanks, Rhys, and thanks for the question. So I guess the initiatives being profiled today are some of the game-changing solutions that are being proposed, and I am aware that in terms of early action, the issue that we're working on, there are other areas across the UN Food System Summit. It's such a broad agenda and it covers so many different aspects that, in actual fact, early action is able to benefit in different places. So, for instance, under the HDP, the Humanitarian Development Peace Nexus, anticipatory approaches are being profiled there as a potential game-changing solution as well. I think the important thing for me is that the UN Food System Summit is able to bring together some of these different initiatives and coalitions. What we need is combined effort. I think we need to bring the states together, the countries, rather than dissipating our resource across lots of different efforts. The more we can align, the more we can work together to achieve these common aims, the better. So I think the Food Systems Summit is throwing out lots of different game-changing initiatives. The important thing for me would be that we align these efforts and trying to pull together in one direction.
Thank you, Ben. So during the course of today's event, I mean, Peter noted it as well, but also Walter and Jerry have also mentioned this a few times about the NDCs issues and how we can kind of use the NDCs as an opportunity to to kind of link the agendas and ambitions of Food Systems Summit and COP26. So my question would be, we mentioned some countries, but it would be nice if maybe we could identify some of the countries that are doing perhaps inspirational or interesting work on their NDCs that other countries could kind of use as a blueprint of how to approach these. Perhaps Walter or Jerry, would you like to go on that question?
I can tell you some concrete examples of the work we're doing in some countries. I'm not sure I want to say that these are examples for everybody else because each country is different. But I'll tell you one thing that we're finding out is that it's critical to help connect the community. So typically in every country, developing and some developed countries too, the different communities work in silos. So you have the climate community, you have the agriculture community, you have the food processing community, and the most significant impact, the best advances that we find is when we are able to connect these communities. So when the climate community understands not just produces information that is interesting, but produce information that is helpful, that is being requested, is being demanded by the socioeconomic sectors. When people learn to understand each other's language, and when you start tailoring your work, not based on your interest, but based on the user's demands, then you start seeing very dramatic improvements in the way that these communities work. And the contributions to good NDCs, they have to have that. They have to have this connection. Otherwise, it becomes a bureaucratic process where a group of people write a set of documents and check the box. What we are really pushing to show, help countries to see that these are concrete opportunities, very important opportunities where you can connect climate, socioeconomic sectors, and produce development programs that are very good for adapting to climate change, to mitigate climate change, to improve risk management, etc. So we're really making a big effort to work in countries and demonstrate that this can be really concrete opportunities.
Okay. Thank you, Walter. And I actually had another question, which I could also pose to you while we're on the subject. So you mentioned the importance of connections. So perhaps I was curious how can the private sector, and particularly in the digital space, which you talked about, how can they better perhaps engage or more effectively engage with the UNFSS and COP26 process to sort of help frame the commitments?
So I would encourage you and everybody attending this event to read the document, the blueprint on this digital informed climate advisories. Because one of the things that the document does, I was saying, is conceptually very robust, but it's also very practical. And what the document does is it maps the world and indicates what is the digital readiness of different countries and what is the vulnerability to climate variability and change. So you have this matrix. And then, of course, if you are in a country that has a lot of limitations for communications, very bad coverage of communications, the private sector has a more limited role there. So in those type of countries that are not digitally ready, that's where we need big effort from developing institutions, from from the countries, from the public funds. Now, when you move to countries like, where you have, yes, big vulnerability to climate variability and change, but the countries are more ready for the implementation of digital tools. And some examples that we know are Vietnam or Uruguay. In those countries, then the private sector has a much more active role to play. So again, I encourage you guys to read this document because it has some very practical suggestions, so like a roadmap for this type of questions.
Thank you. So the G20 recently held its ministerial meeting, and it was the first time that the agriculture ministers and the development ministers were met. So I was curious. Obviously, we've spoken today a lot about UNFSS and COP26, but I'm curious how other bodies of regional or global governance, particularly like the G20, how can they help also kind of promote the links between these two sectors? Perhaps this question might be best directed to either Jerry or Dr. Huck, who might have some perspectives on this.
Well, I'm happy to have a go, and Jerry can come in if he wishes. I think that's a very important development in the G20 meetings this year, where agriculture ministers, along with finance ministers, along with development ministers, and of course heads of government are going to be coming together, because the G20 countries are in essence the set of countries that need to be the pioneers, the first movers in taking things forward for any kind of systemic change to take place at a global level. If the leading countries and leading economies aren't willing to do it or aren't investing in doing it, then it's going to be very, very difficult for the other countries which are not as powerful, not as big, not as able to change systems as these big countries. The G20, in my view, are effectively the leading economies of the world that have a much greater responsibility than the rest of the world in order for them to do the things that they talk about doing. The good thing is they all talk about it. Now, this is not something that's new or even something that there is objection to, but they don't do it. And so making it happen, to me, is the big challenge. How do we actually move from talk to action and deliver on that action and implement? And I think the COVID-19 crisis has shown us that talk is not going to get us out of a crisis. Only action is going to get us out of a crisis. So hopefully the year 2021 will be a game-changing year for the leaders of these 20 countries, the G20 countries, to take things forward. At least I remain hopeful.
Thank you. And Jerry, do you have any further comments on that?
Maybe just a compliment. I really think that the main difference between climate change and food systems is that climate change, we have a framework and business models that actually work on how to tackle the problem. So we're not yet there, but there are models. Unfortunately, those models don't exist yet in the food system space. What needs to happen, I think, is to, in fact, use the framework that is already in place in climate change to, in fact, deal with the issues on food loss and waste, for example, or financial inclusion. It is something that we could do in the context of the work that we do in climate change. We just need to expand it. So I think we could take inspiration from that.
Okay, thank you. So we have a question from Lillian, which I'm going to open to the floor and welcome any of the panelists to contribute an answer to. But Lillian asks, how is gender integrated in the UNFSS processes? It would be interesting to understand what is being done to ensure that the voices of the vulnerable and indigenous communities are considered. Is there anyone who would like to chip in on Lillian's question? Yeah,
I'd be happy to kick it off, and then others can join. So having run the very, very extensive consultation process of the UN Food System Summit, I was co-chair of Action Track 5, but all the Action Track chairs, we have been working very, very closely with each other, making sure that we take a systems approach and don't end up in our own silos. And we've been talking to myriad different constituencies from around the world, and in particular, gender has been a very important part. We have gender focal points, we have gender champions, we have been having meetings with women's groups around the world, and it's extremely well embedded. I mentioned youth as one very important constituency. I would say gender is a second constituency, along with other constituencies of indigenous peoples groups, farmers groups, and many others, private sector, both small private sector and large private sector, all have had a very big role to play. I think one of the innovative features of the UN Food System Summit is a genuinely people summit. There's been participation from all over the world. Unlike other kinds of summit where governments come together and they agree on language for a declaration, this one is about taking actions and including people along with governments. They have a big role to play. But non-governmental entities, non-state actors have had a big role in designing the actions that we have come up with so far, and hopefully will have a role in the implementation of those actions after the summit is concluded in later this month. So gender has been very central in this, absolutely.
And I did see that Astrid had
you.
her hand up
Yes.
to interject here. Please go ahead, Astrid.
Yeah.
Thank you. Thank you very much. And just echoing Salimul, it's a very important topic. It's cross-cutting topic in our Vision 2025. And with that and through the guidance and co-chair personship by Canada and CARE International, we have set up a gender working group and now launching our Gender Center on Excellence on Gender Smart Solutions. And that trickles down into the solutions for the food systems and the agricultural sector, ultimately through our programs, as we are through that Center of Excellence, developing guidance, criteria, sharing best practices on what can be done to better include the gender dimension and the different needs and demands of the female population here in the various sectors and systems. Thank you.
Thank you, Astrid. And perhaps as a kind of final rounding off question, we've this is open to anyone to reply, but we've seen in the headlines, obviously in recent months, a number of sort of climate and weather disasters, in developing countries, in the US, in Europe, Australia, and other regions. So how is that changing attitudes and perceptions of risk and disaster preparedness and policies on climate? So are we seeing a kind of a shifting priorities, or is it a rising priority? And perhaps linked to that, perhaps one of the things we've learned from the COVID-19 pandemic is the understanding of how integrated our world is and how risks are connected. So I just welcome any sort of really broad reflective comments from any panelist on maybe how in a changing world it's sort of driving a shift in policy and how we can take advantage of that in the coming months and the Food System Summit and the COP.
I'm happy to jump in. Oh, sorry. Go ahead.
Oh, sorry. Yeah, Walter first. Yeah.
No, so these extreme events that have been happening around the world and including in developed countries, I think that sometimes wrongly, but sometimes it's making people to connect those extreme events to a changing climate. Then this happens in the context of a pandemic, something that is also global. So I think what is happening is that people around the world, including in the developed countries, are realizing what a global phenomenon can do to societies. And I think that is helping also to realize that even in the richest countries, places like New York City, some of the richest places in the world, even in those countries, extreme events can have a huge impact if you don't have the right system in place. So what I believe is that these type of extreme events are doing several things. One is raising the consciousness of people around the world and connecting them with the climate change, with a global phenomenon like a changing climate that is being viewed as the next global threat. But it's also making everybody realize that even in the most, in the richest countries in the world, the systems for early warning and for early actions are not very good. So this is helping us to also think how the type of systems that we need to establish around the world in developing countries.
Thank you, Walter. Dr. Huck, you wanted to contribute?
Yes. So just building up on what Walter just said, I think the last 18 months or so has been a eye opener globally that has connected climate change impacts that we are now seeing all over the world. The recent report of the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change has very unequivocally said we have already entered a climate change world. This is now not something that is going to happen. It's something that's already happening, and every day is going to get worse. And the COVID-19 has shown us that we are not ready for these kinds of global pandemics and global crises. So the sense of urgency, the sense of crisis, the sense of emergency, I think is something that is new and hopefully will drive action to try and make our systems more robust and more resilient. And that really is the hope that we have, that out of crisis comes some level of improvement in the conditions, because we were certainly not fit for purpose in the past, and building back to the old way cannot be the future at all.
Thank you very much, and so well formulated by Salimul and Walter. The fiscal space is getting tight. I mean, we see that through the crisis and the complex risk landscape that has emerged over the past 1.5 years. The protection gap is widening. I mean, countries with insurance penetration of less than 1% show that the majority of the population is really left behind. And I think what needs to be done is really understanding the risks better, understanding the risk landscape, and also plan ahead, be better prepared, and through the climate and disaster risk finance and insurance solutions that can be, for example, factored in. I mean, to really comprehensively manage the various types of risks that are emerging and are really putting development gains at risk, and put many people back into poverty if nothing happens in the future. I mean, really looking into getting fast liquidity, getting the answers fast, not waiting for development aid that comes later. So urgent action is needed, and I think we can see already a change in the awareness that there needs to be a shift into the ex ante approach rather than waiting and recover.
Thanks. I saw Ben. Ben had his hand up, and then we'll turn to Jerry.
Yeah, thank you.
Thanks, Mark. Well, just to build on the other interventions, I think that preparedness is absolutely crucial. The Crisis Lookout Coalition have done some analysis to show that less than 2% of the finances required for the COVID response were pre-arranged, were pre-agreed and available when required. So just imagine if we can prepare ourselves collectively, to have, say, 50% of the finances required to be able to mount an effective response as soon as we know, there's a major risk on the horizon. We have to switch towards this proactive approach. As Salim mentioned, there's been this growing sense in recent months that we are absolutely in this together, globally. No one will be safe from the changing climate. It will impact all of us in one way or another. And therefore, we have to use this year, COP26, as the moment to set these collective outcomes, the collective goals, and shift towards this anticipatory approach to preparedness, and alignment and coordination as required.
Thank you, Ben. And Jerry, you have some final thoughts?
I think that we are either at a tipping point or a turning point. And what we have seen is that what we cannot do is allow a solution of one problem become the source of a problem to another. So by solving COVID, we end up creating more problems for the climate. So we cannot do that. And we've shown that it is possible to solve both at the same time. We can promote green jobs. We promote activities that actually both reduce emissions and at the same time generate economic activity. We can do the same for food and agriculture and climate change. And I think that is the opportunity that we have at this moment. So I think we need to look for those opportunities that will do both outcomes at the same time.
Thank you, Jerry.
I think we might be just out of time and ready to thank our panel. Thank you all for participating. Again, this conversation is being taped as a live episode of the Global Dispatches podcast. Please subscribe to the podcast, Global Dispatches World News That Matters, wherever you get your podcasts, and you'll be able to access this conversation and many others. It is now my pleasure to introduce Christine Schneeberger, Deputy Head of Global Cooperation at the Swiss Agency for Development and Cooperation, for some concluding remarks. Over to you, Christine Schneeberger.
Thank you very much, Mark, and good afternoon, everyone. I have to say I have enjoyed very much today's discussion, and I would, as a co-host, like to thank all the enthusiastic and brilliant panelists and the participants, and also you, Mark, for the moderation. Let me start with what I would say are my main takeaways of today's event. Both the COP26 and the Food Systems Summit could produce mutually reinforcing action of the intersection between climate and food challenges. Although they are highly aligned in terms of their goals, they are not systematically feeding in each other in a way that reinforces their shared ambitions. The food systems approach requires to take into consideration not only the impact to climate change of food, but also how food contributes to climate change. I think the point on the revision of the NDCs, I won't mention it because it has been said many times, and also Peter mentioned it in the statistics at the very beginning. And thank you, Peter, for showing us those interesting statistics at the very beginning. At the intersection between food systems transformation and climate action, a number of initiatives on climate risk reduction and management enable contributions to reduce risks on food systems that are compounded by climate change. And these initiatives do also protect livelihoods of the people that depend on them. And the initiatives outlined in the discussion today offer a very broad pool of knowledge and tools to couple climate action with food system transformation. And many of you have said it today. The main point is that we need a systematic change. We have also heard that private sector and women have an important role to play, but I would also like to mention that we need the youth and their enthusiasm and their energy for systematic change. For example, in Switzerland, we just launched a global initiative, the 1 Million Youth Action Challenge, which tries to mobilize 1 million concrete actions by youth, individuals or in groups, on concrete climate actions by the end of 2020. Or our mission in Rome, and I was myself at the Food System Preparation Summit in Rome, they have launched an initiative called the Bites of Transformation, where they try to mobilize youth from all countries of the world. And the initiative was even invited to the G20 summit in Italy in June, and that was very positive. I was surprised a bit that the discussions focus today was more like on the production side and not so much on the consumer side. And I think there is a lot of potential there, which we definitely could address. And before I come to share some of like 2-3 examples of the Swiss approach in all of this,
I would like to still mention 2-3 things that I learned. I think it became clear from the discussion that in order to move towards socially fair, politically inclusive, as well as climate resilient development, we have to fundamentally change our attitude. We have to stop unsustainable approaches and adapt our international cooperation models accordingly. Public and private investments and development strategies need to become risk-informed and forward-looking with regards to climate change. Fossil fuel lock-in effects must be avoided. The around 800 million people living without electricity worldwide must gain access to green sources of power. We need investments in inclusive, climate-proof infrastructure with capacity development. Climate and biodiversity must be systematically considered, not only in agriculture, but in mobility or in industry development too. These are all points which really also show that we have to adapt our international cooperation work. And humanitarian aid is another example. This is mainly still focused on delivering aid after disaster strikes. And what we need is to embrace climate change adaptation sincerely and transform our systems. And like Gernot said it in the very beginning too, now that we can predict shocks such as extreme weather, we must adopt an anticipative approach. Because if we wait until the media shows images of affected people, we have failed our mandate to protect those people. And let me highlight also here a few of our Swiss efforts. And you know that Switzerland is really like not only in food system and climate change, but basically in all thematic areas where we work in. We try to really push for a transformative, a systematic change. So I would like to mention some examples. For example, we have been very engaged, what I already said, in the Food System Summit, and that was very much with the goal to contribute to a more resilient and sustainable food systems, in particular through agroecology. This includes work on resource efficiency and resilience of natural systems towards climatic shocks, as well as increased social equity. We invest in prevention and climate risk-informed development. In Laos, for example, we support farmers with climate-smart approaches to both increase tea harvests and strengthen their resilience. Agroecological transitions will require significant policy shifts with conducive and evidence-based programs. And the policy science dialogue is crucial. Switzerland is partnering with CGIAR and the Transformative Partnership Platform to generate such scientific evidence that can feed decision makers in this direction. And we also support partners to work along all moments of crisis, before, during, and after crisis. And since 2012, we support the macro and micro insurances initiatives on the African continent, like the African Risk Capacity, or R4 with the World Food Programme, also mentioned by Peter earlier. They contribute to countries' risk management and capacities and foster resilience with local solutions through a balanced yet decisive engagement with the private sector. And we also invest in better observation, analytics, and early warning systems. Many of you have mentioned them today, so that communities, regulators, producers, and consumers integrate climate services in their daily decision-making processes. An example, in the early warning systems, we support against glacial lake outbursts and floods in the Himalayas of India. So I would like to come to a conclusion, and I would like to do that with a call, really, that in all countries of the world, an inclusive whole of society effort is needed. That includes not only scientists and governments and international organizations, but very much also the private sector, individual consumers, civil society, labor unions, academia, and students, etc. a decentralization and putting communities in the driving seat, especially also women, is of utmost importance. And in order to achieve the Agenda 2030, the Paris Agreement and the Sendai framework, we have to show a much stronger engagement, recognize our common interests, effectively align our policies, stop inventing new buzzwords, but rather speak with one common language. And it's now really up to us to walk the talk and to build on the past pioneer achievements and make climate action, anticipatory actions, and food system transformation work of the people, by the people, and for the people. Thank you. Back to you, Mark.
Well, thank you all. And that concludes our panel discussion and presentation today. Goodbye. All right. Thank you all for listening to this special episode of the Global Dispatches podcast, produced in partnership with CGIAR. We'll see you next time. Bye.